All right, let's go through some headlines, shall we? This is from a Google search that I did on Powergrid attacks. And you can see the top stories that are coming up as I record this on, today is February 10th, I believe, 2023. And we have, just a couple days ago, an alleged plot to destroy power grids in Baltimore that is making the news all over the mainstream websites. In addition to, just a few hours ago, a similar attack as a part of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. We have Russia attacking the Ukrainian power grid with some missiles and destroying it in some way, shape, or form. And it's just interesting to me that these two stories are in the news simultaneously, in the sense of how Russia has been consistently linked to the conspiracy threats in America. Domestic terrorism, Donald Trump, and as they say here, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, anti-Semitic, racists, on and on it goes, right? The words that they have associated with the rising threats of domestic terrorism in the United States, and it has long been associated with Russia. We'll see that as we go through these headlines. So just another interesting thing that's going on where we have this subconscious link to Russia, power grids, and neo-Nazis in the United States. But speaking specifically about that domestic terrorism narrative that I've been going into for a while now in past videos, in this Google search, I went through and clicked on the majority of the links until I got all the way to the bottom, and it would take me too long to scroll down, so I won't put you through that. But I went through all of these links, and it was very fascinating to me that this story did not come up. It wasn't even an option to click on. Didn't even come up in the search from Google, which was January 10th, 2023, so about a month ago. Terrorism suspect told police he damaged power facility for quote-unquote greater good. This is a picture of the person, Mohammed Mesmarian, who is facing arson and terrorism charges, appears in court here in Las Vegas. And here they explain what he did, which was essentially he burned a car next to an electrical substation in Las Vegas with the intent of sending some kind of message, which he explained here was for the greater good of clean energy. This was a solar array in Las Vegas that provided power to one of the big operations down there. I think maybe the MGM Grand. Which as a message doesn't really make any sense, right? You go and burn a car in a solar facility, which presumably is an example of clean energy. Why would you attack something that is the example that you think is the solution to the problem, which is non-clean energy powered by all of the things that are allegedly non-clean? So that's just a little detail that doesn't make a lot of sense. But the bigger idea here is that Mohammed Mesmarian was born in Iran. So he has the Middle Eastern terrorist angle going for his story here. And it just really shows you how obvious the agenda switch has been in the media. If you imagine that this happened in 2005, 4 years after 9/11, right around the 7/7 bombings, imagining this story back then, it would be front page news, headlines everywhere. Iranian-born American attacks domestic infrastructure in terror attack, right? It would added so much fuel to the fire of the war on terror. It would have been everywhere. But now something like this happens, even in the environment where they're trying to promote this idea of domestic terrorism. They don't put this story anywhere near the level that the one in Boston is being blasted out there, or not Boston, Baltimore is being blasted out there, because the agenda has switched to domestic terrorism that is done by a different kind of terrorist, right? So you see the switch in the very fact that this story was nowhere near the news other than local outlets. It wasn't promoted on all the national mainstream platforms because they have switched the agenda and this doesn't fit. Number one, it doesn't fit because it's not the white male domestic terrorist that they are profiling the new terrorist as. But also it doesn't fit because this person was doing it in defense of the environment, in defense of climate change, in defense of the new energy, clean energy that needs to be at the forefront of all of our minds. And obviously they don't want terrorism of the electrical grid associated with that narrative because it is so important to their agenda. So you can see there's a variety of reasons why they would not promote this. But I just thought it was very interesting that this story didn't even come up in the Google search, even though it is so in line with the narrative that is so obviously being promoted. Just very telling that this didn't show up. So moving on here, we have what I referred to in Baltimore. Neo-Nazi girlfriend accused of plotting power grid attack was lifelong radical. Well, there you go. What a beautiful headline. This checks a lot of the boxes that they've been slowly building in the collective's mind over time about what is going on the internet, the radicalization of people online from conspiracy theories and racists and white nationalists and quote-unquote neo-Nazis. It's all here. What a beautiful headline as far as the agenda goes. And we have another example of this from the Wall Street Journal. Neo-Nazi leader, woman charged in plot to attack Maryland power grid. Pair discussed maximizing impact of attack by hitting multiple substations at once, prosecutors say. Again, this is from the New York Times. Pair is charged with plotting to destroy Baltimore by attacking electrical grid. The charges came as experts have warned that the energy grid and electrical substations in particular have become popular targets for far-right extremists. And that goes back to my point about Mohammed Mesmarian in Las Vegas, who does not fit the profile of far-right extremists, and therefore it was left out, even though it fits right in with someone attacking a power grid. Domestic terrorists could take out U.S. power grid, and attacks have started. This is from Newsweek on January 11th, 2023. And this is a day after that Mesmarian story transpired, and there's no mention of that in this article. This is from Time. Is there something more sinister going on? Authorities fear extremists are targeting U.S. power grid. USA Today. Attacks on power substations are growing. Why is the electric grid so hard to protect? Physical attacks on power grids surge to new peak. This is from Politico. People are shooting, sabotaging, and vandalizing electrical equipment in the U.S. at a pace unseen in at least a decade, amid signs that domestic extremists hope to use blackouts to sow unrest. Attacks on U.S. power grids rose to all-time high in 2022 from Bloomberg. Business Insider, the grid is under attack. That's an ominous headline. A record number of attacks on electrical grids plunged thousands of Americans into darkness last year as authorities worry neo-Nazis are targeting critical infrastructure. FBI warns of neo-Nazi plots as attacks on Northwest power grid spike. As a string of attacks on electrical substations unfolded in Oregon and Washington in 2022, the FBI was warning utilities of white supremacist plots to take down the nation's power grid. So as you can see here, we have a very coordinated agenda being promoted by all of the usual suspects in the media. Companies on Texas power grid brace for Russian cyber attacks. This is from March of 2022. out of CBS Austin. So now we're adding the Russian angle to this as well. Russian cyber attack on U.S. power grid meant to be a show of power. Researchers working to thwart the next one. This is from March of 2018. When the Russians hacked into the U.S. power grid last week, demonstrating their ability to shut down the system, Americans learned just how vulnerable we are to enemy cyber attack. According to a report released by the Department of Homeland Security, Russian operatives gained access to American electric, nuclear, water, aviation, and critical manufacturing sectors. Their goal was to show they're capable of taking down our power grid. Now again, here we go. They've established the reality of the situation for everyone, that this is in fact possible. So that when they do something like this, it's in the record that it was definitely possible, and it in no way involved the United States government itself or anyone associated with it. State lawmakers propose power grid protections amid surge in substation attacks. California operator of electricity grid fends off millions of cyber attacks each month. Doomsday on the power grid. Domestic terrorists pose threat to all of us. FBI says 2 men attacked Washington's electric grid in order to commit a robbery. Who's attacking our power grid? From the National Review. This is from CNN. A vulnerable power grid is in the crosshairs of domestic extremist groups. From CBS. Another North Carolina power substation damaged by apparent gunfire weeks after grid attacks left thousands without power. From January 2023. Deterring attacks against the power grid, 2 approaches for the U.S. Department of Defense. Obviously, we're in the territory of think tanks now, asking this as an official research question done by the RAND Corporation on behalf of the Department of Defense. Substation attacks may lead to new energy security rules in 2023, experts say. 2022 ended with a series of physical substation attacks, but the cyber threat remains acute as well. So really, this could go either way, right? We're focusing on the domestic terrorist angle of substation attacks, electrical grid attacks, which implies a physical attack, but they're also including the idea of cyber attacks as well, and it could be done either way. So your guess is as good as mine which way it would actually unfold if this were to go live in some way somewhere, but clearly the option is being left open. Attacks on Pacific Northwest power stations raise fears for U.S. electric grid. This is from Fox News. What is the national power grid and how resilient is it? This is from a U.S. senator from Idaho. Opinion. The next grid attack is coming, from January 11th, 2023. And it was a guest column from the Senator Jim Risch himself. What I find very interesting is that this opinion was released, if I remember correctly, on the very same day. Yes, the very same day that Newsweek ran this article, domestic terrorists could take out U.S. power grid and attacks have started. So on the same day that Newsweek publishes this piece, we have a senator writing the opinion piece, if I can find it again here. Very interesting that this senator releases this editorial on that same day. Security news this week. Attackers keep targeting the U.S. electric grid. Chinese hackers now involved, stealing U.S. COVID relief funds, a cyber attack on the Met Opera website, and more. Power struggles, grid attacks, and extremism in an age of climate volatility. So we're adding the climate volatility to the mix here. Oh, that reminds me of a tweet from Bill Gates. My first job was writing software for the entity that controls the power grid in the Northwest. extreme weather has made it clear grids are a lot more vulnerable today than they were back then. And this is just kind of him reinforcing the idea that the grids are vulnerable in his own way, right? Securing the U.S. electricity grid from cyber attacks. This is from the U.S. GAO. Lloyd's of London. Cyber attack on U.S. power grid could cost over $1 trillion. And obviously, the idea of reinforcing something as vulnerable over and over again is that there won't be a shock when it actually goes down. There will be a rich history of that idea being reinforced before it actually happens. And this is how you write a plausible narrative in a history book. You see, you're establishing your backstory. Get ready, Arizona. Bigger, more sophisticated attacks on our power grid are likely. New York adopts law protecting power grid from cyber attacks. It's not just elections. Russia hacked the U.S. electric grid. And this is referring back to that hack that took place in 2018. And it may just be the first phase of a bigger attack. As threats to the U.S. power grid surge, West Virginia University professor develops advanced solutions for human-machine coordination. 60 Minutes talks electric grid security in response to Ukraine attacks. U.S. power grid was physically attacked 107 times in the first 8 months of 2022, with security experts warning that domestic terrorists could pull off an operation that results in widespread outages and loss of life. Experts warn that the likelihood of a more serious attack is higher than ever. First ever denial of service cyber attack on a U.S. power grid detailed in startling reports. On March 5th, 2019, an unprecedented denial of service cyber attack occurred on American soil, targeted at the U.S. power grid. This leaves a historical mark on American infrastructure and clearly demonstrates the dangers of increased connectivity. The North Carolina power grid attack exposes a troubling reality. The electrical grid has some glaring vulnerabilities. Plots attacks against power grids are increasing nationwide. How vulnerable is Texas? It's a frightening situation, said one energy expert, envisioning a potential coordinated attack on power infrastructure that could cause a cascading failure. Attack on North Carolina power grid shows national vulnerability, former top regulator says. Extremely vulnerable. Attacks on the U.S. power grid spiked an alarming 77% in 2022. Protecting the power grid from cyber attacks. As the national power grid becomes increasingly dependent on computers and data sharing, providing significant benefits for utilities, consumers, and communities, it has also become more vulnerable to both physical and cyber threats. As states report more attacks on their critical infrastructure, Colorado says it's as prepared as it can be. Cyber attacks on our energy infrastructure, the need for a national response to a national security threats. Thwarted plot to attack Baltimore power grid, part of growing domestic terrorism. Feds. A Maryland woman spent months conspiring with a neo-Nazi leader based in Florida to plan an attack on Baltimore's power grid, hoping to further their racist mission, law enforcement officials said Monday. U.S. Energy Secretary warns malign actors trying to down power grid. There are thousands of attacks on all aspects of the energy sector and the private sector generally. Warner says huge vulnerabilities in power grid must be addressed after attack. Could Russia launch a cyber attack on the U.S. power grid? Russia could launch a devastating attack on the U.S. power grid. The country has inflicted malware on America in the past and might not be particularly concerned about the ramifications. FBI investigating after power grid lines attacked in Washington. Should the energy industry prepare for cyber attacks on the power grid? Signs point to yes. Hackers are targeting the industrial control systems devices of power and energy companies. So those were all the headlines from the Google search, and we will end with this.
The most striking finding that we found is that 93% of cyber leaders and 86% of cyber business leaders believe that the geopolitical instability makes a catastrophic cyber event likely in the next 2 years. This far exceeds anything that we've seen in previous surveys.